Tonight, we are one day out from these Mueller hearings and in the middle of several big stories right now. Now, we have a special report on some of the moments from the Mueller hearing that you may not have actually seen. That's later this hour. Also, a top Democrat now alleging that the Trump administration's immigration policy has reached the point of kidnapping. Shocking video emerging. Meanwhile, Washington is, of course, still consumed with this Mueller fallout. And tonight, there's new reporting on an effort by the Trump administration to do something while everyone may be a little distracted. That's cut food assistance for up to 3 million low-income people. For a lot of folks, this is a life and death story, and we're going to cover it. That's later tonight on The Beat. But we begin with this fallout from Bob Mueller's testimony. Democrats are now eyeing a key witness, pushing new subpoenas, and also turning to Trump's finances. While the Mueller hearings did belong, of course, to the chairs of Intel and Judiciary, today it's the Democrat in charge of formal oversight of the administration, Elijah Cummings, who's taking the lead, authorizing new subpoenas to Trump world figures like Steve Bannon and former NSA advisor K.T. McFarland, plus current officials like Mick Mulvaney, family members Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. And these aren't just demands for, say, work email or formal government records, which tend to be carefully written. This is also a request for those people's personal communications. Now, that might sound broad, even to some harsh. But remember, several of these people, including Donald Trump's family members in office, have already been caught using personal accounts to avoid potential accountability. Democrats noting the hypocrisy given these same people's focus on Hillary Clinton's infamous personal email account. Now, having deployed a subpoena to make yesterday's Mueller hearing happen, Chairman Nadler says he is about to enforce a subpoena against the witness that Mueller cited most, former White House counsel Don McGahn.
The very next step, either tomorrow or Friday, is we're going into court to enforce, to ask for the grand jury material and to enforce the subpoena against Mr. McGahn.
Mr. McGahn is key because he is more than a witness to me, if you will, if you remember that one. Because in all seriousness, Mr. McGahn at this point in the Mueller report, as written, and yesterday as testified, was Mr. Trump's would-be co-conspirator. This was the aide that was ordered by Donald Trump to fire Bob Mueller. His refusal to do that is part of why his name appears in the Mueller report over 500 times. So Democrats clearly have a united plan here on tactics, and it makes some sense. Of course you want to get McGahn up there. Of course you want to hear him, in his own words, explain what he did. You can now stack that against what Mueller described and confirmed he did yesterday. Where the Democrats appear still different tonight is not having one single endgame or plan for whether or not to impeach.
Many of us have come forward indicating that we want to see an impeachment inquiry started.
I'm keeping an open mind, but I have yet to be fully persuaded.
He has laid out a roadmap for how we can hold the president accountable, and the only way to do that is through the impeachment process.
And that brings us to a final point about all this Mueller fallout tonight in Washington. You know, the headlines and the judgments, they came as fast as Bob Mueller spoke. This is 2019. No one waits until the end of the whole day to report on such huge developments. And the early headlines were especially tough on Mueller's first answers about obstruction in that morning hearing. And there's no doubt Bob Mueller did duck many of the questions. And he did refuse to join any attempted recruitment onto, call it, team impeachment. But if you watch this show, you know none of that was actually a surprise. We have been reporting on how, one, Mueller was legally a hostile witness. He resisted the Democrats for months. And two, how even as a willing witness in the past, when he would face Congress, which he did many times, he was even then unyielding and, yes, often evasive. Now, while the public was a key audience for Mueller, so the perception in those headlines can matter, the most pivotal decision makers on the ultimate question of what to do about potential obstruction are inside the Congress, inside that building, inside the institution that Mueller was facing. People like Speaker Pelosi, who's still against impeachment at this point, and senators who would ultimately rule on any potential impeachment. Now, one of them, Senator Markey, came out to the floor today to announce his conclusion post-Mueller.
It is time for the House of Representatives to begin a formal impeachment proceeding against President Trump, understanding the gravity of this moment in our nation's history. I stand here today because I believe We have reached the moment where we must stand up for the survival of our democracy.
We've got a lot of great guests tonight. In a few minutes, I'm going to bring on the lawyers, but it's not time for them yet. I'm beginning with the big picture with Bill Kristol, conservative journalist, a former Republican White House official, and director of the group Defending Democracy Together, and Professor Leah Wright-Rigueur, an associate professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Good to see you both.
Good to see you.
To be here.
Professor, I begin with you. As I mentioned, before we bring in the lawyers, you know, lawyers, guns, and money, as they say, now that we've had a day plus to process, given your view, your perch there at the Kennedy School, what was important to you about what we learned yesterday, and how do you contrast that against what the Democrats themselves pitched as a made-for-TV event that wasn't always, at least in every moment, made for TV?
Sure. Well, us historians, sometimes we think fast, sometimes it takes us a long time, so sometimes we rhyme slow. And I have to say, in this case, there are two different outcomes, right? So in the immediate, one of the things that we can look at is say that these hearings didn't necessarily live up to a lot of the hype. There were no explosives, there were no fireworks, that kind of thing. There were no big sound bites. But at the same time, right, in the longer...
You're not saying don't believe the hype, are you?
But actually, I think in the broader picture, in the longer picture, right, if we slow down a little bit, pump the brakes, we might actually see that there was a lot revealed in the testimony. So essentially, Robert Mueller came in and said, here are the facts. The facts line up with what we've been saying for a long time, what the press has been saying, what investigative reports have been saying about questions around the nature of obstruction, about, blocking information, about real serious accusations in disregard for the rule of law. And that is what the American public really needs to remember, really needs to think about. And that's what, and perhaps Congress should be helping the American public think through and really wrestle with, especially on the count of accountability for President Trump.
Bill?
Yeah, I mean, I think when the key decision was made after the Mueller report came down, we knew what we needed to know then, in my opinion, to move to a formal impeachment inquiry. Speaker Pelosi disagreed. She had reasons, and they were both public-spirited, I think, as well as political tactics, and she may be right. I don't know. But having made that decision, I think it's going to be honestly hard to argue that we've learned new things that we didn't know from the report, that a few additional details would make much difference. Either he did enough obstructing of justice to deserve to be impeached based on what we know in the report, or he didn't. I suspect impeachment's not going to happen now, honestly, but I think this is very important. There's a ton of oversight that is very, very important to do and important to publicize to the American public how the Trump administration is running the government of the United States. I mean, that is a huge issue. If he's not going to be impeached and convicted, one of the ways you judge an incumbent president is the Border Patrol, under him, being encouraged to hold American citizens for 3 weeks without letting them, have due process of law? Are other parts of the government, the graft, the corruption, everything else? So I think they should not give up on other aspects of oversight and accountability. But I do think that the key moment was when the Speaker decided, and again, she may be right in this decision, but I think once she said no impeachment inquiry, it all becomes kind of, dotting an I here and crossing a T there and hoping that some witness is going to say something we don't already know. But in my opinion, we knew what we needed to know when we saw the report.
Right, and you've been very clear about that and critical of what you've outlined as Trump's abuse of power. I think it was two pieces, what you say, to build on your point, Bill. It was one, the Speaker drawing that line in public, and then it was two, the President acting in a manner that the House rebuked him for racism, which triggered a vote on impeachment before Mueller even sat down. And knowing that the majority, I mean, this is a metric now, 60% of the Democratic caucus didn't see Trump as impeachable last week. So yesterday became not almost a neutral ground even within the Democratic caucus, but a question of what Mueller was going to do. And that brings us, Bill, to the Bob Mueller that the country saw yesterday. I want to read from the New York Times analysis about what it was and what it wasn't for your view. Mueller came across as neither the avenging angel of resistance fan fiction or the rabid partisan of a Republican portraiture. He was no myth. He was just a man, cautious, maybe a bit hard of hearing, leery of overspeaking and overstepping, bound to the proprieties of another time. Bill, do you agree?
Yes, I think so. And I think your point, incidentally, which I hadn't really thought about, that premature of the vote that was forced last week, forcing the Democrats to go on record when the Speaker hadn't encouraged it, 60% against. Can you honestly say if you voted against impeachment last week, you've learned something now that would change your mind? Is it likely you're going to be able to say much in a month or two? I would add one point. The Trump administration has been ruthless in claiming falsely, I think, various claims of executive privilege and ignoring subpoenas and stalling and running out the clock. And, they're going to continue doing that. So I'm doubtful that we're going to have an aha moment on impeachment over the next few months.
Stay with me as promised. The panel stays, but I bring on the lawyers. A former DOJ official, Matt Miller, will join me in a moment. He told the New York Times in this new piece, quote, Mueller's never cared a whit about public appearances or how he came off in the media because he's always subscribed to the DOJ rule that you speak through your words and actions in court. Matt Miller is here, along with law school professor Jennifer Taub from Vermont. Matt, explain.
I think a lot of people were expecting Bob Mueller to come in yesterday and deliver kind of the final knockout punch for Donald Trump, to take the words of his report and show up as the kind of witness, who would be kind of like Jim Comey has been in his public appearances. And people who knew Bob Mueller, I think, would always tell you that wasn't true. And I think if you didn't know that already, the fact that he looked for guidance from the Department of Justice before going in, the fact that he kind of gave them the opportunity to rein in his testimony was a pretty clear sign that that's what we were going to get. Now, look, the piece, the quote you read from the Times a minute ago, that he was a man kind of, hewing to traditions from another time, I think is also accurate. There was a time when that's what you would like to see the Department of Justice do, and if he had been speaking about an investigation into someone who the department could charge with a crime, I think that would have been the appropriate way to handle it. Of course, as we all know, the Department of Justice doesn't believe the president can be charged. I would have liked to have seen him come in and be a little more open about what he found about the president, be a little more willing to talk about the results of his investigation, because the president is different from everyone else.
Did you want him to be more Comey-esque?
It's funny. I've long thought that if Bob Mueller had been the director of the FBI in 2016 instead of Jim Comey, we'd have had a different outcome. Donald Trump wouldn't be president. And had Jim Comey been the special counsel, I think we would have had a different outcome there as well.
Matt, that's a riddle only a news junkie or a nerd could love. But I think people understand what you're saying, given how much attention their actions have gotten. Jennifer, take a listen to something else that was so important, that was clearly Bob Mueller's passion: the Russian meddling, the new normal, putting America on notice.
Have we established a new normal from this past campaign that is going to apply to future campaigns, so that if any one of us running for the U.S. House, any candidate for the U.S. Senate, any candidate for the presidency of the United States, aware that if a hostile foreign power is trying to influence an election, has no duty to report that to the FBI or other authorities?
Well, I hope.
Go ahead.
I hope this is not the new normal, but I fear it is.
Jennifer?
Yeah, this was one of the most chilling moments, I thought, in yesterday's testimony. And Ari, to quote Killer Mike, Robert Mueller is not an actor. He's not just another talking head telling lies on a teleprompter. This is a truth teller, and we shouldn't focus so much on the messenger, but the message here. And what he's letting us know is that Russia committed many crimes and was quite successful. Russia committed a crime when they hacked into the Democratic National Committee computer systems. They committed a crime when they spread disinformation via social media. They committed a crime when they hacked into the state election infrastructure. In addition to that, in Mueller's own words, Donald Trump and his campaign gave a boost to those activities, and they also built their entire messaging campaign around some of these leaks of stolen information. And here we are, and they're still doing it, and Donald Trump isn't focused on any of the criminality here. Instead, he's still calling this a witch hunt. He's still calling this a hoax, and he's still welcoming interference from Russia and other governments. So here we are, and that is what we really should be paying attention to right now.
Professor Taub, I didn't know you were going to reach for Killer Mike. I think that's from the song Reagan, where Bill Kristol, I think Killer Mike also says, if we don't have a farm, then we don't have wheat. What are the kids going to eat? Do you have any Killer Mike quotes for us, Bill?
Boy, do I not. I'm impressed at all of you guys. I'm deferring on Killer Mike to the law professors and as well, of course, as to you, Ari. I think just one point,
more
though.
Question. Do you know who Killer Mike endorsed in the last presidential campaign?
I do not. I do not.
Anybody know?
Bernie Sanders.
Bernie, yeah, Bernie.
Great.
I'm going to let Bill make up his own point because sometimes it's like we've lost control of the monster we've created. But Bill, and then back to Professor Rigor.
No, just the point about election security is very good. I believe Senator McConnell blocked the consideration of election security legislation today, said the Democrats weren't serious. I don't know if the Democratic bill is perfect or good, but fine, bring something to the floor and amend it. Let's have a debate about it. Kind of an important issue here where they did interfere, they are interfering, and it's not at all clear that the U.S. government is doing what it should be doing to protect our election in 2020. And I think that's a kind of issue where Democrats really legitimately should be just, doing a lot to highlight this, both what the administration's not doing, but especially the fact that the Republican Senate it's one thing to not agree with a particular piece of legislation. They want to spend the money differently, have different guidelines for the states, whatever. It's another thing to not even have a debate about it.
Yeah, we've got that headline up. Professor Rigor?
Yeah, so two quick things. One, I think one of the things that the hearings reinforced is how woefully unprepared the United States is for the 2020 election, particularly around election security and kind of foreign involvement or foreign interference. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, at a certain point in time, all of this talk around corruption, around obstruction, around criminal activity, around grift, around misbehavior and misdeeds, at a certain point, Democrats are actually going to have to do something about it, particularly as voters want something done about it.
Right.
So it's not enough to simply talk around the symbolism, but at some point voters are going to want something. They're going to want to see tangible action. I mean, the NAACP just voted to impeach Trump. So what are the Democrats going to do about it, and are they going to be on the same page? That's a really important thing to think about going forward.
And for our legal experts, before we go, for Jennifer and then Matt, what legally changed yesterday, if anything?
I think the most important thing that changed yesterday is something that my friend Jed Sugarman has brought out in a piece that he wrote and also on Twitter, which is this. Mueller let us know that the OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel opinion, doesn't address the problem of tolling of statutes of limitations. I realize I'm a little bit in the weeds, so what I want to say specifically is, for example, the statute of limitations on charging the president after he leaves office for, let's say, obstruction is 5 years. And should the president win re-election, then that's going to run out, and he would then be immune from being held accountable for these alleged crimes.
You're assuming no more crimes afterward.
Just using that. I'm not actually assuming that, but even assuming that. And so there's a problem there. And because Mueller wouldn't even say that he believed Trump had committed a crime, there's no way to even make these allegations now that we can be sure we can make them unless they're done through the constitutional process of impeachment. And that's why I think it's so important for the House to simply begin impeachment proceedings so that there's a possibility of saying this obstruction is a high crime or misdemeanor.
There's a related issue to the one the professor brought up, and it relates to Bill Barr closing the obstruction investigation after Mueller submitted his report. Mueller said in the hearing yesterday, as he did in the report, that one of the reasons you investigate the president for a crime, even if you can't indict him, is because he might be able to be charged after he leaves office if the statute of limitations hasn't run. So in this scenario, it's a scenario where he loses re-election. Well, that would be, it would be one thing if that investigation had just been kind of left open. Well, what Bill Barr did is come and close the investigation. So what that means is, should there be a Democratic president and a Democratic attorney general, they have to make the affirmative decision to go back in, reopen it, and investigate. That's a big thing to ask a brand new administration to do.
And what you're saying is actually exactly what Trump lawyer Jay Sekulow told me last night on the evening of the Mueller hearings, that they view the issue as closed. They're not worried about post-presidential indictment because Barr moved the goalpost. So someone would have to not just look at it, they'd have to undo that. Bill, Leah, Jennifer, and Matt, thank you so much. Very interesting stuff. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.